Heytesbury is one of the largest private companies in Australia. 6 cattle stations across the Northern Territory, 16,700 square kilometres, 165,000 head. A founding winery in Margaret River and an art collection of more than 5,000 works. So let's be clear straight away. The family did not fall. And one more thing, because it matters more than anything else here. The billion-dollar fraud that people attached to the Bell name was not his. He sold up and walked away in 1988. Alan Bond did that afterwards and went to prison for it. Robert Holmes, a court was never charged with anything ever. This is the story of a lawyer from Johannesburg who became Australia's first billionaire by buying other people's companies, who came within a fraction of owning the biggest company in the country, and who in 53 years never made one thing. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories, the workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Boy at Gweru. Michael Robert Hamilton Holmes. A court was born in Johannesburg on the 27th of July, 1937. His father, Peter Worsley Holmes a Court, was English, a former officer of the Royal Navy. His mother was Ethne Cumming, and she is the more interesting of the two. Ethne was raised on a Rhodesian estate belonging to her stepfather, H.R. Cumming, who had been a colleague of Cecil Rhodes. She grew up with money and land and horses. As an adult, she established and sold a riding school and later ran a game lodge in Chobe, in what is now Botswana. She lived to 98. And when her eldest son went to Australia, she gave him funds to manage. Nobody has ever established exactly where Robert Holmes a Court's first capital came from, but every account points back to his mother. The family lived mainly in southern Rhodesia. From the age of 9 he boarded, first at Cordwaller's Preparatory School and then at Michael House in Natal. And there is one detail from those years that tells you the whole man before he had done anything at all. He sold his schoolmates photographs he had taken of them, and he drove them home in exchange for their travel allowances. He was a boy at boarding school running 2 businesses, both of which involved finding something other people already had, and working out how to take a margin off it. Then the name. He was the great-great-grandson of William A. Court Holmes, the 2nd Baron Heytesbury and the grandnephew of the 3rd. It is a real English barony in Wiltshire, and he never made a secret of it. When he built his own company and bought his own stud in Western Australia, he called both of them Heytesbury, and he used the family insignia. There is one more person to introduce here, and he has to be introduced carefully because his name causes confusion later. Robert had a younger brother called Simon. From 1959, Simon trained as a game warden in the Bechuanaland Protectorate. In May of 1977, he vanished. His abandoned car was found more than 1,000 kilometres from where he had been. His remains were found 3 years after that. One of Robert's own sons is named after him. Robert went to New Zealand and studied agricultural science, taking his degree at Massey in 1962. Then he came to Perth and read law at the University of Western Australia. He was admitted to practice on the 17th of April 1968. He had married a science teacher named Janet Ranford 2 years earlier, on the 18th of May 1966. And by his own account, part of the reason he left Southern Africa for good was that he could not stomach what was being done there. There is a pattern in all of that worth noticing before we go on. His mother had the money, the barony had the name, the photographs belonged to the boys he sold them to. At every stage of his life, the useful thing already existed and belonged to somebody else, and his particular talent was seeing what it could be made to do. So here he is at 31, a solicitor in Perth, in partnership at times with a man named Nicholas Hasluck, who would later become a novelist and a judge, driving 700 kilometres at weekends to run a branch office in Esperance. 2 years later, a failing wool mill in a country town made him. Chapter 2. The Mill at Albany. In 1970, his firm was asked to act as receiver of the Western Australian worsted and woolen mills in Albany on the south coast. Understand what a receiver is there to do. He is the undertaker. He comes in when a company has failed, and his job is to sell the machinery, settle what can be settled, and switch off the lights. He is not there to save it. Understand also what that mill was to that town. It was the single largest employer in Albany. Robert Holmes, our core, did not wind it up. He bought it. Here is how. And it is the entire method in one transaction 5 years before anybody had heard of him. He offered to put $500,000 into the business on one condition, that the Western Australian government forgive $500,000 of its own loans to the mill. He took that proposal to the state's industry minister, Charles Court, and Charles Court agreed. Then there was the deposit, $75,000, and it came out of a bank account he shared with his law partners, who subsequently asked to be repaid. The balance on every account of it came from his mother. Look at what he had actually done. He acquired a factory using the vendor's desperation, the government's money and his partner's cash, and put in almost nothing of his own. And it worked. He re-equipped the mill with modern Belgian machinery on favourable terms, and it kept running. And Albany kept its biggest employer. It is worth being fair about that. He could have done what receivers do. The machinery in that building had a resale value, the land had a value, and the fastest money in the transaction was always going to be in breaking it up. He did the opposite, and several hundred people in a country town kept their jobs for another 2 decades because of it. But that is not why the mill matters. It mattered because it was listed on the stock exchange, which meant that a small, obscure, half-dead company in a country town was now a vehicle, a shell with a share register that could issue paper and buy other companies. And that is exactly what he used it for. He always said the Albany mill was the hardest takeover he ever did. That was probably true, and it was probably true because it was the first. And that is the sentence to hold on to for the next 30 minutes. A man who had never run anything, who had no capital of his own, walked into a dying factory and came out owning a listed company. Everything after this is that transaction repeated at increasing scale. Albany itself is worth a moment. It sits at the bottom of the continent, a deep-water harbour in a granite coastline, a whaling town for a century and a half. It was also the last piece of Australia the first convoy of Australian troops ever saw. They sailed from King George Sound on the 1st of November 1914, and a great many of them did not come back. He was not the first man to see what that mill could do. 30 years before he walked into it, the war had. Chapter 3. What the mill made. The mill kept its own records, and the entry for the 1939 financial year reads like this. This year will be forever memorable, owing to the outbreak of the Second World War. Increased orders were received from the Defence Department for Navy, Army and Air Force at very much better prices. Overtime was being worked to the full extent permitted by law. Sales for the year were the highest recorded since the mill commenced. What it made was blankets and clothing for the armed forces. It went on making them long afterwards. As late as 1963, it was one of only 4 mills in the country contracted to supply 160,000 army blankets. Now the honest limit, because it should be said plainly. Robert Holmes, a court, was 2 years old when that war began, and 8 when it ended, and he spent every day of it in Africa. He has no war record. There is none to find. But his Africa was not quiet. Southern Rhodesia became one of the great Allied training grounds of the war. The Rhodesian Air Training Group operated 11 aerodromes across the colony and trained 8,235 Allied aircrew, pilots, navigators, gunners, ground staff. At its height, more than a fifth of the white population of the territory was involved in it in some way. One of those aerodromes was at Gweru. Gweru is the district where his mother was raised, on her stepfather's estate. The country the boy knew was, for 6 years, a flying school for a war on the other side of the world. There is a third thread, and it is his own company. Bell Brothers was a Western Australian earth-moving and transport firm, and during the Second World War it built the military airfields of the northwest: Broome, Derby, Onslow, Carnarvon, Port Hedland, Pearce. Broome was bombed on the 3rd of March 1942. At least 88 people were killed. 31 years after that, Robert Holmes, a court, bought the company that built the airstrip. None of that makes a boy in Rhodesia a participant in anything. It does mean that the two places that formed him, the country he grew up in and the country he chose, were both, in those years, doing work for the same war, and that the first company he ever owned was part of it. And there is a fourth thread, and it is the one to hold on to. While all of that was happening, one company was making the steel for it. Its managing director, Essington Lewis, ran the entire munitions effort of the Commonwealth and refused to take a salary for it. Its Lysart works put the Owen gun into production, the submachine gun the infantry actually wanted. It built the shipyard at Whyalla out of nothing. That company was BHP. It was the company that armed Australia. In 1983, a lawyer from Perth started buying it. Chapter 4. The Method. In 1973, he took Bell Brothers. The firm had been founded in 1917 by a Scot named W.J. Bell, who had arrived in Western Australia in 1910 and started out carting clay with a single truck. His sons built it into one of the best-known businesses in the state, on 64 acres at Guildford, and in 1969 they bought the first corporate jet in Australia. Holmes, a court, took it through the Albany mill in a reverse takeover worth $9.6 million. The mill swallowed the bigger company. Bell Group became his flagship, and it carried his name to the end. Now, the method, because everything he ever did was a version of the same 5 moves. 1. Find a company worth more in pieces than it is whole. Asset-rich, undervalued, comfortable, with a board that has stopped worrying. 2. Accumulate quietly and in stages, using options and agreements with other parties so that nobody watching the register can see the size of the position building underneath it. 3. Stack the vehicles. Haighesbury owning Bell Group owning the cash-rich Bell Resources, so that control runs down through the pyramid on a fraction of the capital. 4. And this is the one people miss, take a profit even from the bids you lose. Board defending itself in a panic drives its own share price up. And if you already hold the shares, you can sell into the defence and walk away richer for having failed. 5. Be your own everything. BHP's managing director Brian Lowton described him to the Federal Treasurer in one sentence. He is his own financial advisor, his own lawyer, his own analyst, and his own operator. He is phenomenal. And there was the silence. He negotiated by saying nothing at all. John Elliott, who spent a great deal of time on the other side of a table from him, said they spent long stretches just looking out the window, and that it irritated him, because he wanted to get away to the football. There is a sixth thing, and it is not a technique. It is temperament. He did not need to be liked, and he did not need to be understood, and in a business where most men talk themselves into trouble, he had worked out that saying nothing costs nothing. Board members who sat opposite him described the same experience. A courteous, softly spoken man asked a question and received an answer, and then simply waited, until whoever was across from him started filling the silence with things they had not meant to say. The proof of the method is in the failures. In 1979, he went for Ansett and lost it to Rupert Murdoch. He walked away with $11 million. In 1981, he went for Eldersmith Goldsboro, Mort and Lost. He walked away with $16.5 million. There is a word for that pattern, and the word is green mail. It is not a compliment. It was also not a crime, and he was never charged with anything. And then he stopped losing on purpose. Chapter 5. The Great Acquirer. The press gave him a name. They called him the Great Acquirer. Later, when he was selling rather than buying, they called him the Great Disposer. London, January 1982. Lew Grade was one of the great showmen of British television. He had made The Muppet Show and Thunderbirds and 100 other things. And he ran a company called Associated Communications. He was in trouble, and he let Holmes a court buy 51% of the voting shares to help him out of it. Within weeks, Grade had been deposed in his own boardroom. He said afterwards that the new owner cleared out the staff, even, he said, his tea lady. What came with the company was extraordinary. The Stolmos Theatre chain in the West End, the ITC Film Library, and a music publisher called ATV, which owned the copyrights to the Beatles catalogue. He sold it to Michael Jackson, and as part of that negotiation, he extracted something no other Australian businessman could have thought of. He got Michael Jackson to appear on a telethon on his own television station in Perth in 1985. A note on one image, because it recurs. There is a well-known photograph of Lew Grade sitting with Jim Henson, and it has been circulated as a picture of Robert Holmes, a court. It is not him, it is two other men. The connection is real. Henson's Muppet films had been financed through Grade's company, and after the takeover, Henson had to negotiate to buy his own characters back. But the face in that photograph belongs to somebody else. It is worth pausing on what that acquisition actually was, because it is the purest illustration of him. He did not build a television company or write a song. He bought a struggling British business from a man who needed help, removed him, and inside it found the rights to the most valuable popular music ever recorded, and then sold those rights on to somebody else. At no point in that sequence did anybody in his employ create anything. The rest of it came quickly, 4% of Rolls-Royce. 9.6% of Texaco for $800 million American dollars, later sold on to Carl Icahn. 13% of the American miner Asako, television stations in Perth and Adelaide, radio, country newspapers, and in 1987, the West Australian itself, the paper of record in his adopted state. He ran all of it out of St. George Terrace in Perth. In that decade, it was the most confident street in Australia, a boomtown on the wrong side of the continent, 3,000 kilometres from Sydney and Melbourne, and quietly frightening both of them. He arrived at his own shareholders' meeting in a gold-coloured Rolls-Royce, and there was one thing he bought that he did not trade. He and Janet had been buying paintings since the late 1960s. What they assembled became more than 5,000 registered works, with a serious and deliberate emphasis on Indigenous Australian art. He chaired the board of the Art Gallery of Western Australia from 1986. The collection is still together, and it is still public. In November of 1984, every household in the country learned his name. He was asleep on the other side of the world when it happened. Chapter 6. Black Night. It is Tuesday the 6th of November, 1984, and you are one of 82,740 people at Flemington. It is warm. There are roses along the fence and hats everywhere, and the smell of cut grass and spilled beer, and the whole country has stopped for one race. You have $3 on something else. Number 17 is a bay carrying 50 kilograms out of barrier 11 at 10 to 1. The trainer is George Hanlon, a Victorian who has already won 2 of these and wants a third. The jockey is Peter Cook. The horse is called Black Knight, and here is the thing about him. He was not bought. He was bred by the owner at the owner's own stud out of a stallion the owner had paid $300,000 for, a horse called Silver Knight, that had won this same race in 1971. There is a man beside you with a form guide folded to the point of illegibility, explaining to nobody in particular why the favourite cannot lose. The bell goes. The barriers open somewhere across the flat, where you cannot properly see, and for the first 40 seconds it is just a rumour carried on the loudspeaker. They come around the turn and into the straight, and the noise starts at the top of the grandstand and rolls down. Black Knight wins by 2.5 lengths in 3 minutes, 18.9 seconds. Now look for the owner. He is not in the mounting yard. He is not in the members' stand. He is not on the course at all. He is in London on business, and by one account of that afternoon, he is asleep. His wife Janet walks up to the dais and accepts the Melbourne Cup on his behalf, and that is the photograph that runs in every newspaper in Australia the following morning. That is how most Australians first met the Holmes, a court name. Not through a takeover, through a horse. He owned the winner of the Melbourne Cup. He bred it himself. He did not watch it, and he did not have $1 on it. 2 years later, he went after something considerably larger than a horse. Chapter 7. 29.93. You have to understand what BHP was in 1986. $10 billion on the market, 60,000 employees, 180,000 shareholders, and most of them were not institutions. They were ordinary people who had bought a parcel decades earlier and never sold. $3.4 billion a year to the Commonwealth in tax, royalties, and levies. And it was the company that had armed the country in the war. People called it the Big Australian, and they were not being ironic. Research done in the mid-80s found that Australians talked about BHP as though they personally owned a piece of it, because a great many of them did, and it had a particular meaning in Melbourne. BHP was headquartered there. Its board was drawn from the same handful of families and clubs, and it had been run for decades on the assumption that it was less a company than an institution. Institutions do not expect to be bought. Here is the sequence. In 1983, he made a first tilt through a Perth company called Wigmore's. He got about 2%, and almost nobody took it seriously. A pastoral state lawyer having a go at the Big Australian was a joke in Melbourne. By 1984, he held 4.5%. In October 1985, the market found out he held 11, and the way he had done it was the cleverest thing he ever executed. He had an options agreement with John Spolvins of Adelaide Steamship, and while everyone watching believed he was selling BHP stock down, he was accumulating behind it. In January 1986, he made his move, a bid of $1,295 million to take him to 39%. On a register that's scattered, 39% is not a stake. It is control. At his peak, he held 29.93% of BHP. Then came the defence, and it is still the most astonishing 48 hours in Australian corporate history. On the 10th and 11th of April 1986, John Elliott's Elders XL went into the market and bought close to 20% of BHP, reportedly at $10 million a minute. BHP then bought $1 billion of Elders preference shares in return. That is a cross-shareholding, and it was built for exactly one purpose, which was to lock him out. Canberra could have stopped him and chose not to. The Hawke government declined to intervene on national interest grounds. Gareth Evans, then a minister, had dinner with him in March 1986 and wrote it up in his diary that night. He described absolutely unashamed arrogance, or perhaps, he corrected himself, better to call it supreme self-confidence. And then, in the same entry, the sheer class of the man, light years, he wrote, beyond anything BHP itself could muster. In the end, they made peace. He joined the BHP board. So did Elliott. Think about where that leaves him at the end of 1986. Born in Johannesburg, raised in Rhodesia, a suburban solicitor in Perth 18 years earlier, sitting on the board of the company that made the guns, holding 29.93% of it. 18 months later, it was gone in a week. Chapter 8. What the paper paid for. Before that week, it is worth putting the case for him properly, because there is one, and it is usually left out. He was an outsider, and he stayed one. No family firm, no Melbourne club, no old money in this country, no establishment behind him. He arrived with a law degree, a wife who taught science, and his mother's confidence. Everything he took from people who had inherited their position from somebody else. He was also right about BHP. The company he raided was slow and comfortable, and had not been made to justify itself to its own owners in 20 years. And after him, it never had that luxury again. Shareholders in his own companies did extremely well for a decade, and a great many ordinary Western Australians made money alongside him. He did not fight the unions, which almost nobody in his position managed. He charmed a Labor government rather than declaring war on it. And there is something else that ought to be said, because it is unusual for the period. He came out of white Southern Africa in the 1960s, which was a place actively organised around the idea that some people counted and others did not. And he left it. The collection he spent 40 years assembling has at its heart the work of Aboriginal artists. Those two facts sit together. He kept the art together, and it is a national asset. 5,000 works, and one of the significant Indigenous collections in the country, still public, and the mill. He is the only man in this story who was handed a failing factory with instructions to close it, and instead spent money on new machinery and kept the town's biggest employer open. That is on the ledger, and it belongs there. Now the other side, and the best account of it, was written by a man who watched the entire decade from the inside. Trevor Sykes covered Australian business for the Financial Review for 30 years, and then wrote the standard history of what happened in the 80s, a book called The Bold Riders, published in 1994. His conclusion about that generation of men fits in one line. They were, he wrote, essentially traders, buying other people's assets rather than creating new ones. That sentence is the whole answer, and it rules out the easier explanations. It was not bad luck. It was not one bad week in October. It was not the Melbourne establishment closing ranks on a man from Perth, and it was not a conspiracy. It is simply that a business which only ever buys has nothing underneath it when the buying stops. 29.93% of BHP is not a steelworks. It is a number on a register, and a number on a register can go to nothing in a week. There is no factory still running when the share price falls. There is no ore in the ground. There is a stack of holdings in other people's companies, and when they all fall at once, there is nothing else to sell. Both halves of that are true, and neither cancels the other. On the 20th of October, 1987, the buying stopped. Chapter 9. October. More than half of what Bell Group held was shares in other companies, and in a single week, every one of them fell. He said it himself afterwards, and it is the most honest sentence he ever gave a reporter. We were overexposed to the world's stock markets. 4 days after Black Monday, Merrill Lynch withdrew a financing facility of around $720 million American dollars, and then his own structure closed on him. Heytesbury owned Bell Group. Bell Group owned Bell Resources. Bell Resources had the cash, but a subsidiary cannot buy its own parent, and while he tried to find a way through that, other raiders were circling the shares: Kerry Packer, John Spalvins, Ron Briley. The pyramid that had let him control an empire on a fraction of the capital was the thing that stopped him saving it. Bell Group shares fell from nearly $10 to $1.30. How much he personally lost depends on which obituary you read. Reuters put it at $830 million American dollars. The Washington Post put it at $1.4 billion. They were published in the same week, about the same man. The 29.93% went first. Bell Resources sold most of the BHP holding at a loss, which Time magazine put at $206 million American dollars, and the man who had spent 3 years assembling it announced the sale, by one account, in about 8 minutes. In April 1988, out of cash, he sold. Bond Corporation and the Western Australian State Government Insurance Commission each took 19.9% of Bell Group. He kept about 6%, and he walked away with somewhere near $350 million. And now the part that has to be said slowly, because 40 years of pub conversation has got it wrong. What happened next was not his. After Alan Bond took control, Bond took $1.2 billion in cash out of Bell Resources and moved it into his own company. He was convicted for it. He went to prison. The state's insurance commission lost more than $160 million of public money on that deal, and a royal commission was eventually held into the government that made it. Robert Holmes, a court sold. Alan Bond looted. They are two different events done by two different men, and only one of them was a crime. There is one more thing about that sale that gets forgotten. He was not ruined by it. He walked out of the wreck of his own empire with more money than almost anyone else in the country had. And he was 50 years old, and he immediately started again. He spent the next 2 years rebuilding. Vasse Felix, a small winery in Margaret River. Cattle stations, theatres in London. Quieter things you could stand on. On the morning of the 2nd of September, 1990, he died of a heart attack in bed at his stud south of Perth. He was 53 years old. He was a heavy smoker and a diabetic, and by his wife's account, he had been under unbearable pressure for 3 years. And then this, Australia's first billionaire. A man who had spent 20 years constructing the most intricate corporate structures anybody in this country had ever built. A man who was a qualified lawyer died without a will. They searched. There was not one. Under Western Australian law, his estate went 1/3 to Janet, and the remaining 2/3 equally among the 4 children. There was no war in that family over the money. The war was already running somewhere else, and it had another 30 years left in it. Chapter 10. 30 years. Years later, Janet Holmes à Court was asked what it had been like to live with him. She said that almost from the day she met him, she was besotted with Robert and under his spell, and that she was not the only person under his spell. And then she told a story about a cup of tea. He brought her one once. She thanked him for it, and he said, "I made it for myself. I forgot you were here." Bell Group collapsed in 1991. In 1995, the liquidators sued 20 Australian and international banks, arguing that they had pulled their money out of a company they already knew was finished, at the expense of everybody else owed anything. The case was funded largely by the Insurance Commission of Western Australia, which is to say by the public, chasing back public money that a state government had put into Alan Bond's takeover 7 years earlier. The scale of what followed is difficult to convey. The first judgment ran to 2,600 pages. The state had to put a one-time contribution of $4 million into its own court system simply to cope with the appeal. Professor Ian Ramsey of the University of Melbourne told the ABC in 2013 that in terms of the dollars involved, he was not aware of any other piece of litigation in this country that came close. In 2013, the banks settled, and about $1.7 billion went into a pool. Then the creditors began fighting over the pool. In 2015, the Western Australian Parliament passed a law to seize the money and distribute it in the state's own favour. On the 16th of May, 2016, the High Court of Australia struck that law down unanimously, in its entirety. And in August of 2020, Justice Jenny Hill of the Western Australian Supreme Court approved the final distribution in a matter which she noted had been going on for at least 30 years. The banks paid $1.7 billion. The lawyers took at least $300 million of it. And not $1 went to anybody named Holmes a court, because they had walked away in 1988. The name being argued over in that courtroom in 2020 belonged to a Scotsman who arrived in Western Australia in 1910 and started out carting clay with one truck. Alan Bond died in 2015, 5 years before that final judgment. John Elliott died in 2021. Robert Holmes, a court, had been dead for 30 years by the time a court finally worked out who was owed what. So what is there now? Janet Holmes, a court, took over a wrecked company at 46 years old, in a business that did not expect women in it, and ran it for 15 years. She sold what had to go and kept what mattered. She sat on the board of the Reserve Bank. Her son Paul owns Heytesbury outright today. He is the largest individual pastoral landowner in the Northern Territory. 16,700 square kilometres across 6 stations and 165,000 head of cattle. They include Victoria River Downs, established in 1883, once the largest cattle station on earth. He also runs Vassar Felix, the founding winery of the Margaret River wine region. Peter lives outside Nairobi and works with refugees. Another son funds independent candidates for federal parliament. The art collection is still together. And that is the strangest thing about this story. The man made his money on paper, and it did not outlast him by a year. His family put it into dirt and vines and cattle and paintings, and all of it is still there. In Albany, there is a wall. It is heritage listed, and behind it there is not much left. That is all that remains of a woolen mill that made blankets for the army in 1939 and made a billionaire in 1970, and makes nothing at all now. He bought a wool mill, an earth-moving company, a television station, a newspaper, a theatre chain in the West End, and the Beatles catalogue. He got to 29.93% of the company that armed Australia, and in 53 years he never made one thing.